Margaret Johnson carefully counted her money at the kitchen table. The morning sun came through her window and warmed her hands as she placed her bills in neat piles. Rent money here, grocery money there, medicine money in a separate envelope. At 78 years old, Margaret had learned to stretch every dollar of her monthly Social Security check. Today was bank day. Margaret always went to the bank on the third Thursday of each month. She had been going to Coastal Trust Bank for 15 years, ever since her husband Paul had passed away. The people at the bank knew her. They smiled when she came in. Sometimes, she brought them cookies at Christmas. Margaret put on her blue coat and comfortable shoes. Her knees hurt these days, but she still liked to walk the 6 blocks to the bank when the weather was nice. She put her money and bank book in her purse and locked her front door carefully. The spring air felt good as Margaret walked slowly down Maple Street. She waved at Mr. Garcia, who was watering his flowers. She patted the Thompsons' dog, who always ran to the fence to greet her. These small moments made her feel connected to her neighborhood. When Margaret arrived at Coastal Trust Bank, she noticed it was busier than usual. New faces were behind the counter. Only Nancy Miller, a kind woman in her 30s, was familiar to Margaret. "Good morning, Nancy," Margaret said with a smile. "Busy day today?" "Very busy, Mrs. Johnson," Nancy replied. "We've had some changes recently. New manager, new policies." Margaret nodded and waited patiently in line. When it was her turn, she handed Nancy her deposit slip and Social Security check. "I'd like to deposit this and get my usual cash for the month, please," Margaret said. Nancy typed on her computer. Then her face changed. She frowned slightly and looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Johnson, I see a service charge on your account. A maintenance fee of $150 was taken out last week." Margaret's heart jumped. "A fee? What fee? I've never had fees before." Nancy turned her computer screen so Margaret could see. "The bank changed its policies last month. All accounts must now keep a minimum balance of $2,500 or there's a monthly maintenance fee." Margaret felt her face grow hot. $150? That's almost half my grocery money for the month. I never heard about any new minimum balance. "We sent notices to all customers," Nancy said, but she didn't sound convinced. "It was in the mail about 6 weeks ago." Margaret shook her head. "I never got any notice. I read all my mail carefully. I would have remembered something that important." People in line behind Margaret were getting restless. Nancy looked over Margaret's shoulder at the growing line. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnson. There's nothing I can do about the fee. It's the new policy. Would you like to make your deposit now?" Margaret felt small and embarrassed. Her hands trembled slightly as she took out her reading glasses to look at the screen. "Could I speak to the manager, please?" she asked quietly. Nancy hesitated. "Mr. Peters is very busy today with the regional director's visit. There might be a long wait." "I'll wait," Margaret said firmly. She stepped aside so Nancy could help the next customer. Margaret sat in a hard plastic chair in the waiting area. 1 hour passed. Her knees ached. She watched people come and go. Young people with nice clothes and busy lives. They didn't sit and wait like she did. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes, a young man in an expensive suit approached her. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Alan Peters, the new manager. I understand you have a question about your account?" Margaret stood up slowly, using her cane for support. "Yes, Mr. Peters. There's a $150 fee on my account that I knew nothing about. I never received any notice about a new minimum balance requirement." Alan Peters didn't offer Margaret a seat in his office. They stood in the lobby where everyone could hear. He barely looked at her, checking his phone as she explained her situation. "Mrs. Johnson, the bank sent notices to all customers," he said in a bored voice. "We can't be responsible if customers don't read their mail. The fee is bank policy now." "But I live on a fixed income," Margaret explained. "I get one Social Security check each month. I can't keep $2,500 sitting in an account. I need that money. For food and medicine." Alan Peters sighed as if Margaret was wasting his time. "I understand, but we have to remain competitive in today's market. Operational costs have increased. The fee stands. You should have read the fine print in the letter we mailed." Margaret felt tears form in her eyes. In all her years as a customer, No one at the bank had ever spoken to her this way. She felt invisible, unimportant. "Is there someone else I could speak to?" she asked. "Someone at the main office, perhaps?" Alan glanced at his watch. "You can call customer service if you want. The number is on your statement. Now, will you be making your deposit today or not? We have other customers waiting." Margaret nodded silently. She returned to Nancy's window and completed her transaction. Her hands shook as she put the receipt in her purse. The money she received was $150 less than usual. She would have to be very careful this month. As Margaret walked home, she felt a heaviness in her chest that wasn't just from her heart condition, it was the weight of feeling powerless. For 50 years, she had worked hard. She had been a school secretary, raising 2 children with Paul while he worked at the factory. They had always paid their bills on time. They had been respected members of the community. Now she was just an old woman who didn't matter anymore. When Margaret reached her house, she saw her neighbor Betty Adams working in her garden. Betty had been Margaret's friend for 20 years. They shared coffee every Saturday morning and watched out for each other. "You look upset, Margaret," Betty said, putting down her gardening tools. "Is everything okay?" Margaret tried to smile, but couldn't. "Just bank troubles, Betty, nothing important." "Come have some tea and tell me about it," Betty insisted, taking Margaret's arm gently. In Betty's bright kitchen, Margaret explained what had happened at the bank. The unfair fee, the rude manager, the helpless feeling. "It's not just the money," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "It's how they made me feel. Like I was nothing but a bother to them. Like I didn't deserve respect after 15 years as their customer." Betty's face grew serious as she listened. Unlike Margaret, Betty Adams was not a quiet woman. She had been a high school principal before retiring, and she didn't tolerate injustice. "This isn't right, Margaret. They can't treat senior citizens this way." "What can I do?" Margaret asked. "It's just how things are now. Old people don't matter much." Betty poured more tea and thought for a moment. "My nephew Frank is working on that movie they're filming outside town, the one with Clint Eastwood." Margaret looked confused. "What does that have to do with my bank problem?" Betty smiled. "Probably nothing. But Frank says Mr. Eastwood is very interested in how businesses treat elderly people. He was the mayor of Carmel once, you know. He stood up for senior citizens' rights." "That's nice," Margaret said, "but I doubt a famous movie star would care about my little problem." "Maybe not," Betty agreed. "But I'm going to call Frank tonight anyway. The worst that can happen is nothing changes, and I have a feeling Mr. Eastwood might have something to say about how Coastal Trust Bank treats its elderly customers." Margaret didn't believe anything would come of Betty's plan, but as she walked home later, she felt a little lighter. Someone had listened to her. Someone thought she mattered. She didn't know that by this time next week, Clint Eastwood would walk through the doors of Coastal Trust Bank and change everything. Betty Adams waited until after dinner to call her nephew Frank. She sat in her comfortable living room chair, the one with the flowered pattern that her late husband had bought her for their 30th anniversary. The evening news played quietly on the television as she dialed Frank's number. Frank answered on the 3rd ring. "Hey, Aunt Betty. Good to hear from you." "Hello, dear. How's the movie work going?" Betty asked. She was proud of her nephew. At 32, Frank had worked hard to build a career in the film industry. He wasn't a director or actor, but his job as a production assistant put him right in the middle of the action. "Busy but exciting," Frank said. "Mr. Eastwood is amazing to work with. The man is in his 90s and has more energy than most of the crew half his age." Betty smiled. This was the opening she needed. "That's actually why I'm calling, Frank. I was wondering if you could mention something to Mr. Eastwood. It's about my neighbor Margaret." For the next 10 minutes, Betty explained what had happened to Margaret at Coastal Trust Bank. She described how the bank had charged Margaret $150 without proper notice, how the manager had treated her with disrespect, and how Margaret now worried about making ends meet this month. "That's terrible, Aunt Betty," Frank said when she finished, "but I'm not sure what Mr. Eastwood could do about it." "I've read that he cares about how senior citizens are treated," Betty explained. "When he was mayor of Carmel, He helped pass rules to protect elderly residents. I thought he might have some advice, or maybe he knows someone at the bank who could help. Frank was quiet for a moment. It's true. Mr. Eastwood does talk about respecting seniors. Just yesterday he was telling a story about his mother and how businesses sometimes take advantage of older people. So you'll mention it to him? Betty asked hopefully. I can't promise anything, Frank warned. He's very busy, and we're behind schedule because of the rain last week. But if I get a chance to speak with him privately, I'll bring it up. That's all I ask, Betty said. Thank you, dear. After hanging up, Betty wondered if she had done the right thing. Maybe it was silly to think a Hollywood star would care about their small-town problems. But she had to try something. Margaret was too proud to fight for herself sometimes. The next morning, Frank arrived at the film set earlier than usual. The crew was filming at an old ranch about 20 miles outside town. The scene involved Eastwood's character confronting a corrupt local official, which made Frank think about his aunt's call. As Frank helped set up equipment, he noticed Clint Eastwood sitting alone under a tree reading over the script pages for the day. This was unusual. Normally, Eastwood would be surrounded by assistant directors, makeup artists, or other actors. Frank took a deep breath and approached. Good morning, Mr. Eastwood. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Eastwood looked up and gave a slight smile. I'm fine, thanks, Frank. Frank nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. Sir, I hope you don't mind, but there's something I wanted to mention to you. It's about my aunt and her elderly neighbor. Eastwood closed his script. What about them? Encouraged, Frank briefly explained Margaret's situation with the bank. He described how the new manager had dismissed her concerns and how the unexpected fee was causing real hardship. Which bank is this? Eastwood asked when Frank finished. Coastal Trust Bank on Main Street, Frank replied. My aunt says they've been changing a lot of policies since the new manager took over. Several older customers have been hit with surprise fees. Eastwood was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful. We're filming downtown tomorrow, aren't we? Yes, sir. The diner scene is scheduled from 9 to noon. The bank is just a block from there? Eastwood asked. Frank nodded, his heart beating faster. Was Eastwood actually considering getting involved? I might pay them a visit during our lunch break, Eastwood said simply. I've had some experience with banks that forget who their customers are. Thank you, sir, Frank said, trying to contain his excitement. My aunt will be so grateful. Eastwood shrugged. Don't thank me yet. I'm just going to ask some questions. He picked up his script again, signaling the conversation was over. That evening, Frank called his aunt. Mr. Eastwood might visit the bank tomorrow, he said. I can't believe he's actually going to do it. Oh my goodness, Betty gasped. Should I tell Margaret? Frank thought for a moment. Maybe not yet. I don't want to get her hopes up if nothing comes of it. You're right, Betty agreed. But I'll make sure she goes to the bank tomorrow. She mentioned needing to ask about her statement. The next day, Margaret had no idea what might happen as she walked slowly to the bank. She simply wanted to get a printed statement to help her adjust her monthly budget after the unexpected fee. Inside Coastal Trust Bank, things were unusually busy. Margaret noticed several employees straightening their desks and a woman polishing the glass doors. The bank seemed tense, as if everyone was on edge. Nancy, the teller, looked stressed when Margaret approached her window. Good morning, Mrs. Johnson. How can I help you today? I just need a printed statement, please, Margaret said. I'm trying to redo my budget after that fee you charged. Nancy lowered her voice. The regional director is visiting today. Everyone's nervous. Before Margaret could respond, the bank's front doors opened. A hush fell over the lobby. Margaret turned to see what everyone was looking at, and her mouth fell open in surprise. Clint Eastwood walked into the bank. He wasn't alone. A younger man with a professional-looking leather bag followed him, but all eyes were on Eastwood. Tall and lean with his trademark squint and measured movements, he looked exactly like he did in the movies Margaret had watched over the years. Alan Peters, The bank manager, who had been so dismissive to Margaret before, practically ran across the lobby to greet the famous visitor. "Mr. Eastwood, what an unexpected honor." Alan gushed, extending his hand. His voice carried across the quiet lobby. "What brings you to our bank today?" Eastwood shook the manager's hand briefly. "I've been hearing some concerns about your bank's policies regarding senior customers." His voice was low but clear, with that familiar gravelly quality that had made him famous. Alan's smile faltered. "Concerns? I assure you our policies are standard in the industry." Eastwood looked around the lobby, his gaze stopping when he spotted Margaret. "Are you Margaret Johnson?" he asked directly. Margaret could barely speak. She nodded, clutching her purse tightly. "I'd like to talk with you and Mr. Peters here about what happened with your account," Eastwood said. "Would that be all right?" Yes," Margaret stammered. "Of course." Alan Peters looked confused and increasingly nervous. "Perhaps we should speak in my office," he suggested, gesturing toward a door at the back of the lobby. "That would be fine," Eastwood agreed. "Mrs. Johnson, would you join us?" As Margaret followed them toward the office, she noticed Betty Adams entering the bank. Betty gave her a small smile and a thumbs up. Suddenly, Margaret understood. This wasn't a coincidence. Betty had somehow made this happen. Inside Alan's office, Eastwood didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he introduced the young man who had accompanied him. "This is Greg Brown, my attorney. He specializes in elder law and consumer protection." Alan Peters's face turned pale. "Attorney? I don't understand why legal counsel would be necessary for a simple discussion about bank policies. Let's start with hearing Mrs. Johnson's experience," Eastwood said, finally taking a seat and gesturing for Margaret to do the same. "Then we can decide what's necessary and what's not." As Margaret began to explain what had happened with the surprise fee, she felt something she hadn't felt at the bank last week. She felt heard. With Clint Eastwood's steady gaze on her and his occasional nod of understanding, Margaret found her voice growing stronger. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible anymore. Alan Peters' office felt smaller with Clint Eastwood in it. The famous actor sat calmly, his posture straight but relaxed, as Margaret finished explaining how she had been charged the $150 fee without proper notice. "So you never received any letter about the policy change?" Eastwood asked Margaret. "No, sir," Margaret replied. "I check my mail carefully every day. Bills go in one pile, personal letters in another, and advertisements in the recycling bin. I never saw anything from the bank about minimum balances or new fees." Alan Peters cleared his throat. "We sent notices to all customers 6 weeks ago. Mr. Eastwood, it's possible Mrs. Johnson overlooked it or mistook it for junk mail." Eastwood turned his steady gaze to the bank manager. "Did you send these notices by certified mail? Any way to confirm they were received?" "Well, no," Alan admitted. "That would be too expensive for a routine policy update." Greg Brown, Eastwood's attorney, had been taking notes. Now he looked up. "Mr. Peters, are you aware of how many senior citizens bank here at Coastal Trust?" Alan shuffled some papers on his desk. "I don't have the exact number. Perhaps 20% of our customers are over 65. And how many of those seniors have accounts that would fall below your new $2,500 minimum balance requirement?" Greg asked. "I don't have that data readily available," Alan said, his voice growing defensive. Eastwood leaned forward slightly. "Let me understand this correctly. You implemented a policy that would likely affect many of your elderly customers, who often live on fixed incomes. You sent notice in a way that couldn't be confirmed. Then when Mrs. Johnson came to you with a problem, you dismissed her concerns and refused to consider her circumstances." Alan's face flushed. "Mr. Eastwood, with all due respect, banks are businesses. We have to make profitable decisions." "I've been in business most of my life," Eastwood replied calmly. "I've directed films, owned property, and even served as mayor. One thing I've learned is that good business isn't just about profit. It's about treating people fairly." Greg Brown pulled a folder from his leather bag. "I took the liberty of looking into similar cases before we came here today. In the past month, 17 senior citizens have filed complaints with the State Banking Commission about Coastal Trust's new fees. Alan Peters paled. Complaints? This is the first I'm hearing of this. That's concerning, Eastwood said. A good manager should know when customers are unhappy, especially when there's a pattern. Margaret sat quietly, watching the exchange. She had never imagined being in a room with Clint Eastwood, let alone having him speak up for her. It felt surreal. Alan turned to his computer and typed rapidly. Let me check Mrs. Johnson's account again. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding. While he searched, Eastwood spoke gently to Margaret. How long have you banked here, Mrs. Johnson? 15 years, she replied. My husband and I opened our account here when we moved to town. After Paul passed away, I kept coming here because the people were always so nice. Until recently, that is. Alan looked up from his computer. I see the fee was automatically applied by our system when the account fell below the minimum balance. But given the circumstances, I could make an exception and refund the fee as a one-time courtesy. Eastwood shook his head. That's not enough. Mr. Peters, this isn't about one customer or one fee. It's about how your bank treats seniors in general. Greg Brown nodded in agreement. The Banking Commission takes age discrimination very seriously, and there are federal regulations about proper notification of fee changes. Alan Peters began to look worried. Are you suggesting we've broken banking regulations? I'm suggesting, Eastwood said firmly, that you have an opportunity to fix a problem before it gets worse. Mrs. Johnson isn't the only senior affected by your new policies. Alan looked from Eastwood to Greg Brown, then to Margaret. For the first time, he actually seemed to see her as a person, not just an account number. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Eastwood? Alan asked. Before Eastwood could answer, there was a knock at the office door. A nervous-looking young woman poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Peters, but the regional director is here for your scheduled meeting. Alan jumped to his feet. Tell him I'll be right there. Actually, Eastwood said, I think the regional director should join our conversation. This concerns Coastal Trust's policies at a higher level than just this branch. Alan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. But after a moment he nodded to the assistant. Please ask Mr. Daniels to join us. While they waited, Margaret gathered her courage to speak. Mr. Eastwood, I want to thank you for taking time to help me. I never expected anything like this. Eastwood smiled slightly. No thanks needed, Mrs. Johnson. Sometimes people just need a reminder about what's right. The office door opened, and a tall man in an expensive suit entered. He stopped short when he saw Clint Eastwood sitting there. Richard Daniels, Regional Director for Coastal Trust, the man said, recovering quickly and extending his hand to Eastwood. This is quite a surprise. Eastwood shook his hand. We were just discussing your bank's policy changes and how they affect senior citizens. Richard Daniels glanced at Alan Peters, whose face showed clear discomfort. I see. And what is your interest in this matter, Mr. Eastwood? I don't like seeing people treated unfairly, Eastwood replied simply. Especially seniors who have worked hard all their lives and deserve respect. Greg Brown explained the situation with Margaret's account and the other complaints filed with the Banking Commission. As he spoke, Richard Daniels' expression grew more serious. This is concerning, Daniels said when Greg finished. Mr. Peters, were you aware of these complaints? Alan shook his head. No, sir. This is the first I'm hearing of them. Daniels turned to Margaret. Mrs. Johnson, I apologize for your experience. This is not how Coastal Trust aims to treat its customers, especially long-standing ones. Margaret nodded, surprised by the sincere tone in his voice. Mr. Eastwood, Daniels continued, what would you suggest we do to address this situation? Eastwood looked at Margaret, then back to Daniels. First, refund Mrs. Johnson's fee and any similar fees charged to seniors who weren't properly notified. Second, review your policy about minimum balances for customers on fixed incomes like Social Security. And third, create a better system for seniors to address concerns without feeling dismissed. Daniels considered this for a moment. Those are reasonable suggestions. In fact, our corporate office has been developing a senior banking program that addresses some of these issues. We could implement it here as a pilot location. Alan Peters looked surprised. A senior program? I wasn't aware of this. It hasn't been announced yet, Daniels explained. But given these circumstances, I think this branch would be the perfect place to launch it, and Mrs. Johnson could help us ensure it meets the needs of our older customers. Margaret blinked in surprise. Me? How could I help? By telling us what would make banking easier and more respectful for seniors, Daniels said. Your perspective would be valuable. For the first time since entering the bank, Eastwood's serious expression relaxed into a small smile. That sounds like a good start. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Richard Daniels took notes as Margaret, encouraged by Eastwood's presence, shared her thoughts about how the bank could better serve elderly customers. Alan Peters mostly listened, occasionally adding comments about what might be practically implemented. By the time they finished, Margaret had not only gotten her $150 back but had also been invited to join a new senior advisory committee for the bank. More importantly, she had been heard and treated with respect. As they left the office, Margaret noticed Betty Adams still waiting in the lobby, pretending to fill out deposit slips. Their eyes met, and Betty gave her a questioning thumbs up. Margaret smiled and nodded. Mrs. Johnson, Eastwood said as they walked through the lobby, would you like a ride home? My driver is waiting outside. Margaret couldn't believe her ears. That's very kind, Mr. Eastwood, but my friend Betty is here. She gestured toward Betty, who was trying not to stare. Bring her along, Eastwood said with a slight smile. I'd like to hear how she convinced her nephew to talk to me about this situation. As they walked out of the bank together, Margaret noticed all the employees watching them with amazed expressions. The same people who had ignored her last week were now seeing her leave with Clint Eastwood. It was a moment Margaret Johnson would never forget. The black car with tinted windows pulled up in front of Margaret's small house. The driver, a polite young man in a suit, opened the door for Margaret, Betty, and Clint Eastwood. Betty could hardly contain her excitement as they stepped out onto the sidewalk. Would you ladies like to come in for some coffee? Margaret asked, feeling both nervous and proud to invite such a famous person into her home. I'd like that, Eastwood said simply. Margaret's living room was neat and filled with memories. Family photos covered the walls and shelves. A quilt made by her grandmother lay folded over the back of a worn but comfortable couch. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Please sit down, Margaret said, gesturing to the couch. I'll put on some coffee. Let me help, Betty offered, following Margaret to the kitchen. In the kitchen, Betty could barely keep her voice down. I can't believe Clint Eastwood is sitting in your living room. Wait until I tell my bridge club about this. Margaret smiled as she measured coffee grounds. I can hardly believe it myself. And the way he stood up for me at the bank. She shook her head in wonder. When they returned with coffee and some cookies Margaret had baked yesterday, Eastwood was looking at the photos on Margaret's wall. Is this your husband? He asked, pointing to a picture of a tall man in an army uniform. Yes, that's Paul, Margaret said. He served in Korea. We were married for 47 years before he passed. Eastwood nodded respectfully. My father was in the army too. Different war, same dedication. As they sat down with their coffee, Eastwood explained more about what had happened at the bank after Margaret left. His attorney, Greg Brown, had stayed behind to talk with Richard Daniels about the legal aspects of the bank's policy changes. They had agreed that Coastal Trust would review all accounts affected by the new minimum balance requirements, especially those belonging to senior citizens. Mr. Daniels seemed genuinely concerned when he understood the problem, Eastwood said. I think he'll follow through on his promises. Why did you decide to help me? Margaret asked, still curious about why a movie star would take an interest in her small problem. Eastwood sipped his coffee before answering. My mother lived to be 97. In her later years, I saw how some businesses treated her differently, with less respect because of her age. It bothered me then and it still bothers me now. Betty nodded. My nephew Frank mentioned you had spoken about that on the movie set. Frank seems like a good young man, Eastwood said. He cares about his family. When he told me about your situation, Mrs. Johnson, it reminded me of something my mother experienced with her insurance company years ago. They talked for nearly an hour. Margaret and Betty were surprised by how normal and down-to-earth Clint Eastwood seemed. He wasn't like his tough movie characters at all. He listened carefully when they spoke and asked thoughtful questions about their lives in the community. Before leaving, Eastwood asked if he could take a photo with Margaret and Betty. His driver snapped the picture with Margaret's old camera. I'd like to stay in touch about how things go with the bank, Eastwood said. If they don't follow through on their promises, let me know through Frank. After Eastwood left, Margaret's phone began ringing. Neighbors had spotted the famous actor entering her house. By evening, the whole neighborhood knew something unusual had happened. The next morning, Margaret received a call from Richard Daniels, the regional director from the bank. Mrs. Johnson, he said, I wanted to personally inform you that we've refunded the $150 fee to your account. We're also reviewing all our senior customers' accounts to make sure no one else was unfairly charged. Thank you, Margaret said. I appreciate that. Also, Daniels continued, I'd like to invite you to meet with our customer service team next week. We're developing that senior banking program I mentioned, and your input would be valuable. Margaret was surprised. You really want my opinion? Absolutely, Daniels replied. Who better to help us improve our service to seniors than someone who has experienced the problems firsthand? After hanging up, Margaret sat quietly for a few minutes. Yesterday she had felt invisible at the bank. Today, the regional director was asking for her help. The change felt almost unreal. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked to the grocery store. As she passed Coastal Trust Bank, she noticed Alan Peters through the window. The manager was speaking with an elderly customer, actually sitting down next to the man rather than standing over him. Alan looked up and saw Margaret. After a moment's hesitation, he gave a small, respectful nod. At the grocery store, Margaret ran into Nancy, the kind teller from the bank. Mrs. Johnson, Nancy said with a smile, I heard what happened yesterday. The whole bank is talking about it. Is anyone upset with me? Margaret asked, worried that she might have caused trouble for the staff. Nancy shook her head. Not at all. Actually, many of us are glad someone finally stood up to some of these new policies. They've been hard on customers and employees alike. On her way home, Margaret passed the local newspaper office. The editor, Sam Baker, was just closing up for the day. Mrs. Johnson, he called when he saw her. I've been trying to reach you. Is it true that Clint Eastwood came to town to help you with a problem at the bank? Margaret hesitated. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. Yes, he did help me with a situation at Coastal Trust. Would you be willing to tell me about it? Sam asked eagerly. It would make a great story for next week's paper. Margaret thought for a moment. If you think it would help other seniors avoid similar problems, then yes. The next week, Margaret's story appeared on the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, Hollywood legend champions senior rights at local bank. The article described how Margaret had been unfairly charged and how Eastwood had intervened. It also explained the bank's new commitment to creating better services for elderly customers. The newspaper story caught the attention of a reporter from the city news station. She called Margaret and asked for an interview. At first, Margaret was reluctant, but Betty convinced her to do it. Think about all the other seniors who might be facing the same problems, Betty said. Your story could help them too. The TV interview aired on the evening news. Margaret spoke clearly about the importance of treating elderly customers with respect. She explained how the new Senior Respect program at Coastal Trust would eliminate minimum balance requirements for customers over 65 and provide other helpful services. After the interview, Margaret began receiving calls and letters from other seniors who had experienced similar problems with their banks. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to thank her for speaking up. One letter came from a banking association in the state capital. They were interested in using Coastal Trust's new Senior Respect program as a model for other banks across The state. I never expected any of this, Margaret told Betty over tea in her kitchen. I just wanted my $150 back. Betty smiled. Sometimes the smallest stones make the biggest ripples, Margaret. The following Monday, Margaret attended her first meeting at Coastal Trust Bank as a member of their new senior advisory committee. She felt nervous as she entered the conference room, but Richard Daniels greeted her warmly and introduced her to the other committee members. To her surprise, Alan Peters was there too. The manager looked different somehow, more humble, more attentive. When Margaret offered a suggestion about making bank statements easier to read for those with vision problems, Alan actually took notes and asked follow-up questions. As the meeting ended, Alan approached Margaret privately. Mrs. Johnson, I owe you an apology. The way I treated you was wrong. I've been so focused on numbers and policies that I forgot banks are really about people. Margaret nodded, accepting his apology. We all make mistakes, Mr. Peters. The important thing is what we do after we realize we've made them. Walking home, from the meeting, Margaret felt a new sense of purpose. At 78, she had found an unexpected way to make a difference. She thought about all the seniors who would benefit from the changes at the bank, changes that had started because she refused to be invisible. And it had all happened because Clint Eastwood walked into a bank and flipped everything around. 6 months had passed since the day Clint Eastwood walked into Coastal Trust Bank. Summer had turned to fall, and the trees along Main Street were now bright with orange and red leaves. Margaret Johnson sat on her porch swing, enjoying the cool morning air and watching the neighborhood children wait for their school bus. So much had changed in those 6 months. Margaret thought about it all as she sipped her tea from her favorite blue mug. The biggest change was at the bank. True to his word, Regional Director Richard Daniels had launched the Senior Respect Program at Coastal Trust. Margaret had been part of the planning team, attending meetings twice a month where bank officials actually listened to her ideas. The program eliminated minimum balance requirements for customers over 65. It provided larger print on statements and special teller windows with chairs for seniors who couldn't stand for long periods. The bank even started offering free financial safety workshops to help protect elderly customers from scams. Margaret smiled as she remembered Alan Peters' transformation. The bank manager who had once dismissed her concerns now greeted senior customers by name. Last week, he had even helped Mrs. Rivera, who was nearly blind, fill out her deposit slip. The change in him seemed genuine. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Betty Adams. Turn on Channel 5, Betty said excitedly. They're doing a story about the bank program. Margaret hurried inside and turned on her television. A young reporter stood outside Coastal Trust Bank. Behind her was a banner that read Senior Respect Program now at all Coastal Trust locations. What began as a pilot program at one local branch has now expanded to all 50 Coastal Trust locations across the state, the reporter said. The program, which eliminates fees and creates special services for elderly customers, has been so successful that other banks are starting to follow suit. The camera switched to show Alan Peters speaking to the reporter. We realized we needed to do better by our senior customers, he said. They built this community and deserve our respect. This program has actually improved our business overall, as many families are now bringing their banking to us because of how we treat their elderly relatives. Margaret couldn't believe it. The small change that had started with her complaint had grown into something that helped seniors all across the state. The phone rang again. It was Frank, Betty's nephew. Are you watching the news, Mrs. Johnson? He asked. Yes, Margaret replied. It's amazing to see how things have changed. Mr. Eastwood saw it too, Frank said. He asked me to call and invite you to the movie premiere. Next week, it's the film we were shooting when all this happened. Would you like to come? You and Aunt Betty both. Margaret's hand trembled slightly. A real Hollywood premiere? I wouldn't know what to wear. Don't worry about that, Frank laughed. Mr. Eastwood said to tell you just to be comfortable. He wants you to meet some people from a senior advocacy group who will be there. They're interested in taking the bank program nationwide. After hanging up, Margaret sat in her living room looking at the framed photograph on her wall. It was a picture of her, Betty, and Clint Eastwood taken the day he had driven them home from the bank. In the photo, Margaret was smiling wider than she had in years. Next to that photo was a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Hollywood Legend Champions Senior Rights at Local Bank." Margaret read it often, still hardly believing it had happened to her. The doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Nancy Miller, the kind teller from the bank who had first told her about the fee. "Mrs. Johnson," Nancy said with a smile, "I'm on my lunch break and thought I'd drop this by." She handed Margaret an envelope. Inside was an invitation to a special event at the bank. "Coastal Trust Community Heroes Award," it read. Margaret's name was listed as one of the honorees. "The bank is recognizing people who have made a difference in our community," Nancy explained. "You're being honored for your role in starting the Senior Respect Program. Mr. Peters wanted to deliver this himself, but he's at a meeting in the city today." Margaret shook her head in wonder. "I never set out to be recognized for anything. I just wanted to be treated fairly." "Sometimes that's how the biggest changes start," Nancy said. "One person standing up for what's right." After Nancy left, Margaret called Betty to tell her about the award and the movie premiere invitation. They talked excitedly about what they might wear and whether they would see other famous actors there. Later, that afternoon, Margaret walked to the small park near her house. She liked to feed the ducks there and watch families enjoying the playground. As she sat on her usual bench, she noticed an elderly man struggling to read a document. "Would you like some help?" Margaret offered. "I have my reading glasses if the print is too small." The man looked up gratefully. "Thank you. It's a letter from my bank. They're changing something about my account, but I can't make out all the details." Margaret felt a surge of confidence as she took the letter. 6 months ago she might have sympathized but stayed quiet. Now she knew better. "Let me see that," she said kindly. "I've learned quite a bit about banking lately, and if there's a problem, I might know some people who can help." As she explained the letter to the man, Margaret thought about how one small action could lead to unexpected changes. She had only wanted her $150 back. She never imagined she would help create a program that was now helping thousands of seniors, or that she would be attending a movie premiere with Clint Eastwood, or receiving a community award. The following week, Margaret and Betty found themselves walking down a red carpet at the movie premiere. Photographers took their pictures, and a few reporters even asked them questions. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that her daughter had sent her for the occasion, while Betty chose a bright red outfit that matched her bold personality. When Clint Eastwood spotted them, he walked over and greeted them warmly. "Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Adams, I'm glad you could make it." "We wouldn't have missed it," Margaret said. "And please call me Margaret." Eastwood smiled. "Margaret, there are some people I'd like you to meet. They're from the National Senior Rights Alliance. They've heard about what happened at Coastal Trust and want to work with other banks across the country to implement similar programs." As Eastwood introduced her to the representatives, Margaret noticed a news camera filming them. Later, she would see herself on the evening news, described as the woman who inspired a banking revolution. That night, after the excitement of the premiere, Margaret sat quietly on her porch again. The neighborhood was peaceful under the stars. Her phone had been ringing all evening with calls from friends who had seen her on television. Margaret thought about Paul, her late husband. He would have been so proud. He always told her she was stronger than she knew. It had taken a surprise bank fee and an unexpected Hollywood intervention for Margaret to discover that strength in herself. The next morning, Margaret walked to Coastal Trust Bank as she did every month. But now, instead of feeling small and invisible, she entered with her head held high. The security guard greeted her by name. Alan Peters waved from his office. Several elderly customers smiled and nodded, recognizing her from the news. As Margaret completed her transaction, a young woman approached her. "Excuse me, aren't you Margaret Johnson, the one who helped start the Senior Respect Program?" Margaret nodded, still not quite used to being recognized. "My grandmother banks here," the woman said. "She told me how much better things are now. I just wanted to say thank you." As Margaret walked home, she thought about how life could change in unexpected ways. At 78, she had found a new purpose. She was no longer just an elderly widow living quietly on a fixed income. She was Margaret Johnson, senior advocate. And it had all started because she refused to accept being treated unfairly. Sometimes, Margaret thought, all it takes is one person to speak up and another person to listen. And occasionally, that second person might just happen to be Clint Eastwood.